2021 has been a tough year for South Africans. Loadshedding, COVID-19, a changing political landscape and a battered economy has all taken its toll on the health and emotional well-being of most South Africans. The end of this year brought more bad news with the discovery of a new COVID-19 variant, Omicron, with consequent cancelled international travel plans, with the so-called festive season likely to be another bleak one for many families. I'm Catherine Rice, multimedia journalist for News 24, and this is The Story. This week we'll be talking to News 24 editors and journalists about some of the biggest stories to dominate the headlines in the country this year.
You're listening to The Story. It's a podcast by News 24. We'll speak to journalists and experts about the week's biggest story. This is what we saw, heard, and uncovered this week.
We're now joined by political editor for News 24, Juanita Hunter. Juanita, thank you for your time. It's been a non-stop news cycle of ups and downs for your team. The local government elections signified a new era in South African politics, with the ANC losing significant support. Would you say that has been the defining political story of the year? Is it a turning point in South African politics?
Absolutely. I think that there was an expectation that the ANC would perform badly at the polls, but I don't think there was the realization that you'd have the results that you would, that where the ANC not only lost key metros, but also the fact that it lost support in traditional areas like Soweto and in townships. You saw the ANC drop well below 50%. You also saw an unprecedented occurrence where more than 60 councils across the country, of about 250, did not have an outright majority, ushering an era of coalitions in a way that we have not seen before.
What for you have been some of the most important political developments we've seen this year? And what do you think is going to have the most impact on our lives as South Africans going forward?
I think probably the most important story was the incarceration of former President Jacob Zuma and the consequence thereof. It was a story that persisted from the beginning of the year, as the former president did not want to cooperate with the Zondo Commission to go and testify about what he knew in relation to state capture. He did not want to abide by a constitutional court ruling that forced him really to go and testify and to comply with the commission. He sustained attacks on the judiciary to center stage in the first quarter of the year and led up to June and July, where we had the very clear judgment from Justice Sisi Kampepe that said the former president had to be incarcerated for 15 months as a result of contempt of court. And we saw the defiance from his supporters and from him. He did not hand himself over. And then we saw the drama ensuing until he arrived at the Escort Correctional Services, where he began serving his sentence. But then what you saw in the days subsequent to that was mayhem, bedlam that ensued in South Africa in ways that we had not seen. The constitutional order of this country was completely and utterly in jeopardy as his supporters, together with organized crime syndicates and other nefarious groupings, created chaos in most parts of KwaZulu-Natal and in Gauteng, resulting in the loss of lives of over 360 people and about 50 billion rand being wiped off the country's economy. We saw data coming out just this week saying that the economy shrunk by 1.5% as a result of COVID-19, which is obviously a very big story this year, but also as a result of that violent unrest that this country was subjected to. Again, the story still persists because we did not see real consequences for that. There's often a threat that it may happen again because there has been no definitive action taken. And the reality of it is that the state was completely overrun, and the failures of the security cluster was on full display during those 8 days in July.
Certainly a terrifying time it was. Thank you so much for your time. That was Juanita Hunter, politics editor for News 24. We're now joined by assistant editor for breaking news, Sheldon Marias. Sheldon, there have been so many major stories this year. This is probably quite a difficult one to answer. But for you, what were some of the top breaking news stories aside from COVID-19 and politics?
It's always a difficult one to answer. And in thinking about this, I thought, look, what were the things that people actually spoke about? So not us as journalists, because we can, sometimes become quite esoteric, but what people actually speak about. And there were two things or two topics, two stories that people spoke about, I found this year. One was the July unrest, because I think that had significant impact, not only on the economy, as we've seen with GDP figures coming out, but in terms of people's lives, their livelihoods, their businesses, the well-being of their families. Speaking to people who are in KwaZulu-Natal and hearing some of the stories that came out, the anecdotes of how people, were down to the last 10, 20 rand in their wallets, and these were not people who didn't have any money. This was because, they couldn't go to shops that were accepting cards, and we've become so reliant on our cards these days. And you would never have thought of something like that. But these were the things that were happening to people. And I think the impact it had, not only on people who were in KZN, on people who had businesses in parts of KZN and obviously Gauteng as well, where the major points of the unrest were, but just the general country, people wondering, where to next? Is this what we're going to have to contend with in South Africa? So it really affected people's psyches and what they were talking about, what they were considering, what it meant for them as well. So I think July unrest definitely was one of the biggest stories of this year, outside of COVID, as you mentioned, and possibly for some people even bigger than COVID itself. It really was something that drove politics, that drove news, that drove business, and we're still trying to understand the fallout and the impact of what happened. Not only did it have an impact on and bring to the fore questions of poverty, because you saw people who said, listen, we're not in this for any political gain, we don't care two ways whether former President Jacob Zuma goes to prison or not. This for us is about our livelihood, about being able to have food for the first time. So it brought to the fore South Africa's inequality, South Africa's poverty. It brought to the fore cracks in our policing and our justice system. You had the police minister and top brass of the police going off against the intelligence community, the fractures in the police being highlighted as well. Recently, we've had the South African Human Rights Commission having those inquiries into exactly what happened in July and how it came to be. So I think that just highlights just how deep the July unrests actually ran, and that it was deeper than just, a group of people, as we are led to believe, who were unhappy with President Jacob Zuma, or former President Jacob Zuma, being jailed. And that in itself was a momentous story. Here we saw a sitting president, a democratically elected president post 1994, going to prison, serving time in prison. And that was something that, many South Africans never thought we would see.
And would you say this year has been busier for your journalists than last year? And if so, what do you think has really kept them on their toes?
I think so. I think that the news landscape is just becoming ever busier. There's South Africa's never quiet on the news front. There never is a lack of stories. I mean, if I think to one of the year's other biggest stories that people were talking about, and that kept our journalists busy at a time when you had COVID, we were in that long stretching third wave as well. We started the year off in the second wave. We had the third wave during the mid-year, and we were going to end off with a fourth wave. But what kept us busy during that third wave was the story of the Tembisa 10. this was when I talk about stories that people were talking about that kept the nation gripped, was the story of the Tembisa 10. Now, it feels quite odd to say the story of the Tembisa 10 because by all indications, there never was the Tembisa 10, and that would have made it a world record. The first time a mother has given birth to 10 babies in one go. Initially it was this feel-good story that South Africans were hungry for. We'd been in this, we started the Europe in the second wave, as I mentioned. Then we had the third wave, which just seemed to stretch for months and months. We were in a very dark place. And this was even before the July unrest. And we love a good news story in South Africa that sets us on top, that puts us on top of the world, We're not on top of the world in many instances, but, when we do get it, we love to grab it and we love to milk it. We thought this was one of those moments again. But as the story unfolded, the basics of where would such a procedure happen, that couldn't be confirmed. Why was this not being fated, by the hospital, by the doctors? Who were the doctors? What was the backstory to this? Who did the procedure? How did they get the technology, the thinking, to deliver 10 babies successfully? How were the babies? What were their names? South Africans love that. But as the story went on, our journalists just couldn't find any of this. And the story began to unravel. News 24 did a lot of work around getting to understand the protagonists involved, some of the people that they were related to as well, and the deeper and deeper our journalists went into this. I mean, we had a team of 2 or 3 journalists at any time working on this. So if you're talking about what kept us busy during that period, this was one of those, and you still had the story of COVID to tell. COVID is ever present. It's a story that we all live with every single day, and there are new developments, and it's our duty to bring those new developments to our readers and our audiences. But at the same time, there's so much else happening in a country that is really grappling with a number of deep-seated issues.
Absolutely, and certainly never a dull moment in our country, that's for sure. Thank you so much for your time. That was Assistant Editor for Breaking News, Sheldon Marias. We're now joined by Bevan Lakay, Health Editor for News 24. Bevan, South Africans were hopeful that this year would be better than last in terms of the impacts of COVID-19, but that hasn't been the case, and the new Omicron variant has sent the world into panic mode. In terms of health reporting, COVID-19 has dominated again. What were some of the biggest developments in terms of the pandemic and how it shaped our lives this year? What do you think about the way the discovery of Omicron was handled, and could it have been managed better?
Thank you so much for having me, Catherine. Look, if we start with Omicron, I think from a South African perspective, we did quite well. Scientifically and from a government perspective, we were quite early in terms of announcing it and being transparent. And I think the most important thing with COVID-19 is transparency, especially with a lot of false information and fake information out there. Unfortunately, factual information can cause a little bit of panic as well. And while South Africa handled it quite well, it wasn't well received internationally, as we saw with travel bans, etc. But as information started coming out, we're learning that most of those travel bans probably were not necessary. It was quite politicized from an international perspective. Governments liked to show their citizens that, look, we're doing something. And so the immediate thing for most of them to do was, initiate these travel bans and say, okay, no travel from South Africa or to South Africa. That was the easy thing to do because in the eyes of their citizens, government is doing something. But from a South African perspective, we gave them the information. We were very transparent about it. And the fact is, variants and mutations will happen with this virus, especially with vaccine coverage not being as it should be, according to scientists. And in any case, viruses do mutate. It's just it's about sharing information and being transparent. And I think from a South African perspective, we have done that. So what we've seen from a a health perspective and also hospital perspective, we're obviously in many parts of the country in the fourth wave, but while infections are much higher and been increasing, it looks so far like hospital admissions aren't as bad as could be, and that will obviously be a lot due to higher vaccine coverage, still not as high as it should be, but a higher vaccine coverage in South Africa. But one of the things we have seen early on is that there have been more children, especially children under 5, admitted, and that could be for a number of reasons. We've covered that in a couple of stories as well. So overall, obviously, while we might have thought that COVID-19, may not dominate, it probably will for a little while longer, because we also need to consider the knock-on effects of COVID-19. So obviously, it has direct effects, of course, with people who get sick with COVID-19. You also got people who then get long COVID, but there are also other knock-on effects, because if you look at lockdowns and otherwise, treatments of other diseases where we've done quite well in the last couple of years. If you look at things like tuberculosis and HIV, etc. And then if you look from a children perspective, you have your normal vaccination coverage. For the last while, we've done quite well with that, but COVID-19 obviously has caused that to be backed up quite a bit, which is quite problematic. We're also looking at people who have been at home and alone for quite some time, and the isolation issues and mental health issues for the last while as well. And not to mention, people are not exercising, so there are other knock-on effects too. So whether we like it or not, COVID-19 will be in our lives for a while longer, directly and indirectly.
Bevan, what are your predictions for next year in terms of the way that COVID currently controls so much of our lives? Is it likely to get any better, or do you think this will just become something we will need to live with forever, with perhaps annual jabs to protect us?
Well, the one thing I can predict is that COVID-19 is unpredictable. In the last 2 years, that's the one thing that stood out for me and has been my biggest concern and biggest fear, is that, the more you learn, you still don't know enough about COVID-19. And that's why it's quite difficult. I think we are going to have to live with it for quite some time. I mean, we will get to a point where we have it under more control, much like I suppose you can say the flu virus, where you have an annual vaccination that can combat that, and it's much more well controlled. But it's going to be in our lives, but it's also in our hands in terms of how COVID-19 dominates our lives. If we do the right things in terms of getting vaccinated, as many people in South Africa as possible getting vaccinated. And there are a couple of things we've learned in the last while, which is that we need to be washing our hands more. I don't think a lot of people always did that. And then also the other thing is, is distancing, which is so important. And I think we, in the last, I don't know how long, we'd actually forgotten about that. We need to give each other space in shopping malls, and outside, everywhere. So distancing is going to be a key important thing that we continue to do. So they're the non-pharmaceutical stuff which will continue. It's just going to be part of our lives, but we also will have to most likely be vaccinated quite regularly for COVID-19. But I think a lot of it's in our hands in terms of how much of a role COVID-19 plays in our lives going forward.
Bevan, what about mandatory vaccines? That's looking more and more likely. What are your thoughts on that?
We wouldn't need it if people just got their vaccines. That's the issue. The science is pretty clear in terms of, vaccination is our best form of protection in terms of COVID-19. That's the one thing that's stood through the last, let's say, year in terms of fighting COVID-19. And it would be best if everybody got the necessary jabs, be it the Pfizer one, which is a 2-shot dose, or the Johnson & Johnson, which is a 1-shot dose. We could discuss boosters, but there are booster jabs coming as well, which will just give you extra protection. I mean, the whole thing about it is to have the best possible protection, and vaccines give you the best possible protection. If it's going to take mandatory vaccinations to get us to that point where more people, or I don't want to say everybody, some people are still going to not get the vaccines, but if we can push some people over the edge to going to get a vaccine, and that's what it takes, unfortunately that's what will need to be done. But the truth is, the information's out there, there's solid science out there, and the science all points to vaccinations. We should be wanting to protect ourselves, and the information's quite clear that vaccination will do that. It's unfortunate, I think, that we're going to have to be forced to do so in terms of mandatory, but that's the next step. If people do not want to willingly go for vaccination, that is absolutely the next step, and that's understandable.
Thank you so much for your time, Bevan. That was Bevan Lakay, News 24 health editor. And finally, we speak to Karen Morn, specialist legal journalist for News 24. Karen, there was certainly no shortage of stories on the court front. What for you were some of the standout ones?
I think some of the biggest stories of this year all centered around a refusal of high-ranking officials to be held accountable for their conduct, whether it was former President Jacob Zuma's constant attempts to undermine the state's efforts to prosecute him for arms deal-linked corruption, Public Protector Busisiwe Mkhwebane's efforts to stop a potential inquiry that could lead to her impeachment based on various, aspects of the rules that she found to be unlawful or unconstitutional, or the Judge President, John Hlophe's campaign to avoid becoming the first judge to be impeached over his effort to swing two constitutional court judges to rule in favor of Zuma in a 2008 case. I think there has been a constant kind of campaign by those powerful individuals to avoid being held accountable. And I think those stories will continue to dominate the courts into 2022.
What do you think are the legal landmarks or court cases we should be looking out for next year?
I think the big case, of course, will be Ace Magashule's attempt to challenge the NPA's evidence against him, which he essentially says does not exist. I think that's going to be a very, very important case for the NPA to prove that it did not simply bring a case against Magashule without having its legal ducks in a row. Certainly, he's made some very disturbing averments, for instance, that, one of the key so-called state witnesses against him, his former PA, was in fact someone who never actually gave an affidavit to the state at the time that it referred to her as a state witness. Certainly, Edward Sodi bringing a similar application in terms of challenging the state's evidence against him, but on the basis that they had relied on Zondo inquiry evidence, which he contends were not legally allowed to do. So those cases will prove to be incredibly important, both for the NPA in terms of establishing that it has the credibility it needs to take on high-level corruption matters, and also for the Zondo inquiry, how the state utilizes evidence or the kind of information that was uncovered by that inquiry in a legally permissible way.
Well, thank you so much for your time. That was Karen Morn, specialist legal journalist for News 24. That's it from us this year. We'll be taking a season break, but we'll be back in the new year. I'm Catherine Rice, and this week's episode was produced with the help of Alyosha Kolstock.